Thanks for listening to A Long Time in Finance with Jonathan Ford and Neil Collins, in partnership with Briefcase.News, the service that brings intelligent curation and analysis to your media monitoring. Jeff Bezos drove across America in a battered car and set up Amazon about as far west as he could go, the city of Seattle. These days, Amazon is a giant globe-spanning corporation with a market capitalization just shy of $2 trillion, and Bezos is the second richest man in the world. Supercharged by the COVID pandemic, Amazon now accounts for something close to a third of US retail sales, and its UK sales have doubled since 2018. In some segments, it has around a third of the market. Some say this is just the consequence of innovation and good service, and Bezos is to be congratulated for what he's achieved. Others, however, see things differently, perceiving Amazon to be a giant trust rather in the manner of the industrial corporations assembled by John Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan in the so-called robber baron era in the United States. Do you remember that, Neil?
Almost, yes.
In 2023, America's trust-buster-in-chief, Lina Khan, brought an antitrust suit against the giant. Our guest today, Dana Mattioli, is a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, where she has the beat of Amazon correspondent, a title which I have to say speaks volumes. She's also written a book about Amazon called The Everything War, which examines the group's conduct and whether it's an evil monopolist, as some say. Hi, Dana.
Thanks for having me.
So I suppose we should just kick off with an open question, which is, Amazon, is it really the modern incarnation of Rockefeller's Standard Oil?
I think it's one of the closest equivalents we have to Standard Oil in the 21st century. And the strategies that Amazon deployed to become the size that it is are very similar to what John Rockefeller deployed back in, the 1900s. Amazon and Standard Oil both engaged in predatory pricing. Both companies were known for spying on their competition, and both had engaged in bullying their rivals into engaging in mergers with them. And I think Jeff Bezos used a lot of the John Rockefeller playbook in order to get to the $2 trillion perch that Amazon has today.
It's not a new charge that Amazon is too big for its boots. But despite the fact that, people have made these claims over the years, not a lot has been done about it. I'm interested in what's changed now and, why is it that it's taken such a long time for the FTC in America to start looking into Amazon's behavior?
Yeah, the U.S. has been very slow to policing its own online giants. And there's something that happened. Antitrust laws in the U.S. were first derived in the Gilded Age during the trust buster movement to combat Standard Oil and all these other trusts. And the laws were enforced those ways for decades and decades. But then there was a change in the interpretation of antitrust laws in the 1980s. This group called the Chicago School came around and said, we're doing this all wrong. We're actually inhibiting competition, and we should not be ruling so often for David versus Goliath. And that group said, we should be looking at prices for consumers as the litmus test as to whether companies are engaging in anti-competitive business practices. That took hold. For the last 40-something years, antitrust law was enforced with the lens of whether the ultimate result was resulting in lower prices for consumers or efficiencies in the market, and that favored scale. That meant that this whole crop of digital companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon were able to grow unfettered because for Google and Facebook, for instance, you don't pay to use them. It's free. So they couldn't be doing anything wrong. Amazon's case, in the early days, it undercut everyone on pricing. It was really low cost. That's not the truth today, but back then it was, and it was able to grow to these giant sizes. It wasn't until more recently that this other school of antitrust thinkers came along, these modern day trust busters like Lina Khan, who said, we've allowed these digital Gilded Age monopolies to take hold of our economy. And that's an unintended consequence from the 1980s, and something needs to be done. And just to give you a sense of Amazon's size today, because I think a lot of people find this a bit staggering. We all know that it's an online giant. In the US, 40% of all online commerce happens on Amazon.com, which is enormous. But it's also the world's largest cloud computing company. It's one of the biggest digital advertisers by revenue. In the US, at least, it delivers more parcels than our other giants, FedEx and UPS. It makes the top-selling voice assistant and streaming devices, and it sells 82% of all ebooks. And in addition to that, it's a grocer, a Hollywood studio, a podcast maker. It's getting into healthcare. It's getting into space. So it has this unparalleled reach.
Do you quarrel with the idea that one of the acid tests of a business is whether it is delivering value to the customers? Because looked at from a consumer's point of view, Amazon has been a fantastic boon.
Well, I think it depends on how you define value. Is that price? Is that quality? I'll give you a few examples. A lot of Amazon Prime customers don't realize that 60% of what is sold on Amazon is not sold by Amazon. It's sold by these third-party sellers from around the world. And that's allowed them to have selection just explode on Amazon. It really is someplace you could buy anything, but it comes with a cost. It's totally unregulated. It's this bazaar of goods that are not quality checked. So could you maybe get a cheap carbon monoxide detector on Amazon.com? Sure. But a lot of the carbon monoxide detectors that they were selling on Amazon.com don't detect carbon monoxide. Would I find that to be a valuable product? No, I'd call that a dangerous product. And I found in my reporting that there's a lot of examples like that. There are children's toys that have lead in them. I wouldn't call that a valuable product. There are other dangerous products that have literally gone on to cause fires in people's homes or have been cited for deaths of customers that have bought them. So that's one area that I think there's a trade-off for the selection, that you get lower quality. And when you look at the Federal Trade Commission's lawsuit against Amazon last year, the crux of it is that Amazon has actually raised prices for consumers. There's so many of these third-party sellers on Amazon. And when you speak to them, it's this love-hate relationship. They have to be there because so much shopping happens there. But the terms have gotten so onerous for them. And I'll give you an example. In the last decade, Amazon has been able to raise its fees for those sellers from, on average, 19% of every dollar that a seller makes to 45% of every dollar a seller makes. And when I speak to those sellers, they say in order to have any sort of margin, they've had to raise their prices for customers. And that's what the FTC suit is claiming, that this has created artificially higher prices on Amazon.com, but also on the rest of retail online, because Amazon sellers have a legal obligation until recently to offer the lowest price on Amazon. So if you have to offset the 45% fee on Amazon, you also have to offset it elsewhere.
But I'm interested also in the extent to which it is argued that it is impossible for those sellers or others to find a way to reach the market without going through Amazon. I mean, the extent to which Amazon really is in some segments now a monopoly, and therefore it becomes very difficult to test whether it's possible to buy a good cheaper elsewhere. But what's the evidence on that?
Well, I would say if you're a seller of something in the US at least, if you choose not to sell on Amazon, you're forsaking 40% of the entire online market. So then you're starting at just 60% of a total addressable market. And that's just like for the regular mom and pop seller. We're even seeing this remarkably. Even some of the more prestige luxury brands that are in some of the top high-end markets around the world, like Selfridges or Saks Fifth Avenue, they've even considered selling their goods on Amazon. They sometimes are grappling with whether they could survive without being on this giant digital market. We've seen them go back and forth in different ways because there's just so many eyeballs there.
And is there any evidence of a kind of credible online alternative emerging to Amazon?
For the last few years, other companies have seen that this marketplace model can work. It's asset light. You could charge fees as long as you have the logistics prowess. And there have been other companies that have started their own online marketplaces. If you think about like Alibaba or even Walmart in the US or Target. And there's other versions of that around the world. None of them have gotten the sort of market share that Amazon has, but everyone's trying to play catch up for sure.
Yeah, one of the long-term lessons of retailing is that it is extremely difficult to maintain your position at the top of the heap for decade after decade. And if you look at the big names of 20, 30, 40 years ago, half of them have disappeared because they failed to do so. Why do we think it's going to be any different now? With this organization gets bigger and bigger and have bigger and bigger footprint. In the end, it will go the way of all other retail businesses insofar as it will find a sort of way of making a living, but it won't actually rule the world.
I mean, that's a great point, and that's one of Jeff Bezos's driving neuroses. He says it's always day one at Amazon, and he points to the companies of past that had been the market leaders that lost their way. And he's tried to inculcate the company with this culture of hard driving, scrappy, almost startup, even though they're a $2 trillion company, which is kind of funny because he's fearful of that very outcome.
So he should be. I don't see why Amazon, however big, will be immune from this process.
I would say that Amazon's longevity has been surprising on the e-commerce front. There's examples in the stories from the 1990s where giant retailers like Toys R Us and Borders are lauding this company for being the leader in e-commerce. Amazon's perch has only grown today. This is 30 something years later. So there hasn't been a change in terms of its ability to hold that top position. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be a change to its dominance in e-commerce going forward, but that's almost beside the point because Amazon, I think most people associate it with the brown boxes on their stoops. That's not what it is. That's a piece of what it is. I think its true power is in the Amazon version of the Standard Oil Octopus. It's got all these other tentacles that are weaving their way through American life, UK life, the economy into competition. And that's where the true power lies. It's not in just one of those tentacles. It's in all of them.
John Rockefeller would have approved of what you've just said. He would have said, well, why do we need an FTC investigation? The history will work its miracle and all will be fine for the consumer in the long run. Just let me make my money. Which is no doubt exactly what Jeff Bezos is hoping as well.
Yeah, increasing size means increasing complexity. Increasing complexity adds cost and friction to the business. And by the way, this is still a first-generation company. When it's, instead of being run by the founder or the people that he's appointed, eventually it'll be run by the same sort of bureaucrats that run every other large business which has been around for more than a single generation. And the motivation is not the same.
But Neil, 2 trillion of market cap gives you a lot of buying power. It gives you an ability to make acquisitions of all sorts of up-and-coming businesses, which simply isn't the case if you're a kind of mean, kind of upward punching .com as Amazon once was. So I think it must be in a different league. I don't know. What do you think, Donna? Sorry, we're just rambling to each other now.
I do think it's in rare air right now, and it's funny to me. So they are in their second iteration. Jeff Bezos is no longer CEO of this company. A man named Andy Jassy is, and he is one of Bezos's acolytes, right? Not just the FTC, the EU, other regulatory bodies from around the world have said that this company is too big. It's a monopoly. Something needs to be done so that, the cat's out of the bag, that government at least views this company as too big. In the middle of all these investigations into Amazon, Andy Jassy, Amazon's current CEO, has told his team, we're not big enough. I think that just shows the way that they operate, how much more space they see ahead of them, how they could use their strategic advantages to grow 5 times the size they currently are today.
One of the very striking things about some of the reporting is the extent to which people are prepared to leak very discreditable information about Amazon to you. I suppose in a way, rather like if one goes right back in time to Standard Oil, the way in which I think Ida Tarbell, the journalist who basically got everyone very steamed up about John Rockefeller, got most of her information from some executive who didn't realize quite the extent to which he was giving the whole game away by telling about all these clever tricks they were pulling on kind of railroad companies. But I'm interested in the whole question of the extent to which this sort of weird, very, very competitive and aggressive culture is part of the problem.
I think that there's a direct correlation between this aggressive, cutthroat Machiavellian culture and the anti-competitive behaviors, for sure. So I've covered companies at the Wall Street Journal for 18 years. And when I started the Amazon beat, I was just struck by how different this company was from any other company I've come across. The way that the employees competed with each other, and some of them described it a little bit like the Hunger Games, where they all had to fight to survive to the next year because they do something called stack ranking, where every year, no matter how well the company is doing, the bottom 6% of people get slashed. And on top of that, they have a pay mechanism where they backload pay and you only get the bulk of your salary if you stay to years 3 and 4. And that's directly driven by Bezos. He adopted that stack ranking when he saw Intel doing it back in the 1990s, and he thought this was a brilliant mechanism. But it's had consequences. You know, the number of people I've spoken to at the company that are really brilliant who've had to go on mental health leaves is different than other companies. There's a scene in the book that you know, Jonathan, where an engineer who wanted to join Amazon so badly, he's working around the clock, he's getting great reviews, is now put on a performance improvement plan, which is a precursor to being cut. You know, it's sort of an arbitrary thing. Sometimes really great people get put there because their manager has to cut 6% of their staff. And so even great performers get stuck in that scenario. And he goes to work, he writes out a suicide note, he copies Jeff Bezos, he copies everyone else, and he says, this is a cautionary tale for everyone else working here. And the last line is, now look out your window and watch me fall. And he jumps off the building during work hours. I think how the company responded or didn't respond to that issue is indicative of how things work there. You know, instead of comforting the employees that just witnessed a suicide on the job, instead of maybe reevaluating their culture, their response was to just delete the emails from everyone's inbox and go on with their day. The more shocking behaviors in the book, the behaviors where Amazon is spying on their own sellers or stealing ideas from entrepreneurs that are coming to them for M&A negotiations or for venture funding.
Maybe you could just say a few things about the venture fund, because it is one of the more striking things where if one's talking about corporate power, Amazon is able to use its sort of muscle to put people who it's working with in a very disadvantageous position.
One of the areas in the book that really has stuck with me is how Amazon uses its deal-making and venture capital arms in ways that some of the people that have been opposite it have called it corporate espionage, not deal-making. Amazon, because it's one of the biggest companies in the world, if you are selling your company, you oftentimes have to talk to Amazon because you can't ignore them. And the same goes for venture funding. Amazon has its own venture capital arm inside the company, which is strange for founders because when you're going for a fundraising, if you're speaking to traditional VC firms, you don't have to worry about them competing with you. But for Amazon, you do. There's scenes in the book where these founders go in and they hold talks with Amazon. They share all of their most secretive information. And the same pattern plays out time and time again. Amazon takes the information, they prod them for, details and interviews. They engage for months under the auspices of buying the company or investing in the company. And then all of a sudden, the founders' emails start going ignored. The phone calls don't get returned. And then Amazon, a year later, announces a press release with the very same product that company pitched. And what I found also is that Amazon protected itself from this behavior by having a clause in its NDAs that basically said anything retained in the memory of Amazon executives in those meetings could be used without legal penalty. So as long as they could remember it, they could use it. And to me, that was just so telling.
But surely as that sort of word gets around, people will say, well, I know I'm supposed to go to this behemoth because you can't ignore them. But the risk of them essentially stealing my business is too great. I'd rather settle for somebody who may be slightly less first division, but who will behave in a reputable manner and allow me to grow the business rather than just stealing it from me.
You would think so. It's funny, because of Amazon's NDAs being so ironclad, many of the companies that have been on this side of the equation where they have been ripped off have not been allowed to talk about it. This was some of the hardest reporting I had to do for the book, was getting the details of these anecdotes because people were nervous of being sued into oblivion.
Can I turn to the lawsuit that Lina Khan has brought? Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what this fight will be centered on. We've talked a lot about the culture, the deal making and so forth, but what ultimately is the hill that she's going to fight it out on?
So the FTC lawsuit against Amazon is kind of ironic in some ways. Lina Khan is this modern day trust buster, and she has said that the last 40 years of antitrust in the US have been a disaster, that it's allowed these giant companies to grow and take over, and that we should not just rely on this consumer welfare standard that Bork and the Chicago School brought into the vernacular. And she's brought forward these other lawsuits against Facebook and Microsoft based on different theories of antitrust, but she's lost. So when it came to the Amazon lawsuit, what's really fascinating here is that it is a consumer welfare lawsuit. It's a Borkian in a lot of ways. It comes down to high prices. And she says that Amazon, because of its power in e-commerce, because of its power over sellers on Amazon.com, it's created higher prices for consumers. And some people think that that was done to be more careful because of this string of losses. But ultimately, it's not going to play out until 2026 when it goes to court.
Has Amazon shown signs of changing its behavior since it's received this lawsuit, or indeed in the run-up to it, where it was under investigation but not yet indicted?
It changed a few things around the margins. So, for instance, it took away this requirement for sellers to have the lowest price on Amazon that was in their contracts, which is part of the FTC lawsuit. It started to allow some sellers to have a Prime badge to be a part of the Prime program without using Amazon's logistics, things that people had said were anti-competitive for a really long time. It started paring down its Amazon private brands business and got rid of thousands of SKUs and really scaled back there. But it hasn't made giant wholesale changes to the business practices. And interestingly, behind the scenes, it really hasn't cooperated well with the FTC. There's a scoop in the book where there's some documents that the FTC requested that mysteriously get thrown in the trash. And, more recently, Amazon has destroyed 2 years worth of encrypted text messages that the FTC wanted around its M&A practices and antitrust, right? But I would say this has not slowed Amazon. There was an Amazon big meeting a few weeks after the lawsuit was filed, where they have this giant arena in Seattle where they're located, and all these employees came. And Amazon's bigwigs talk to employees and take questions. And one of the first questions from the audience was for Amazon's general counsel, David Sapolsky. And they wanted his take on the lawsuit. Like, what does this mean for us? Amazon's head lawyer gets on stage and says, this is verbatim, "Haters are going to hate. We're going to shake it off." He basically quoted Taylor Swift and went on with his day. So that's how the company's viewing it.
Have you any idea how long this lawsuit will run before anything is decided? And what will it really turn on?
They'll start discovery soon, but it won't go to court again until 2026, later 2026. And then, these things take a long time to play out. So in the interim, as a consumer, you probably won't see many changes. What it will turn on is the court. There have been different antitrust leaders and faces of antitrust reform in the US over time, but ultimately the courts here decide the validity of a case. So it really all depends on whether Lina Khan's FTC can convince the courts that Amazon is in violation here. And, some of the skeptics I speak to are even concerned that even if she were to win this and the company's broken up, maybe you get into a Standard Oil sort of predicament where, in 1911, the U.S. broke up Standard Oil for being a monopoly. And John Rockefeller fought that decision tooth and nail. But it turned out to be the best thing for him because once the Standard Oil Octopus was broken up into disparate pieces, each of those companies became giants in their own right because they were already so big. It was too little, too late. And a lot of people I've spoken to wonder if that's the case for Amazon.
Somebody should point this out to Bezos and say, if you want to be
yourself.
worth 10 trillion rather than 2, just break yourself up. Yeah. See what happened to Standard Oil.
Yeah.
Maybe you could get a good consulting fee with that, Neil.
Yeah. Be very much the friend to the trust. But what do you think should happen?
I wanted this book to really lift the veil on how Amazon always seems to win, how it's able to sprout new tentacles and take over entire industries. I don't have an antitrust background, so I don't know what the solution should be.
You are a journalist, after all.
I am a journalist. I honestly, I don't know what the answer is. I could see what the Standard Oil people are saying. Think about it. AWS is one of the biggest tech companies in the world if you broke it off from Amazon. Amazon Logistics is already one of the biggest logistics companies in the world. Could there be a value in breaking a company up and decentralizing it and not giving it so much access to data, chopping the head off of the octopus? Possibly, because, they're able to synthesize their power across so many different vertices. They're able to extract concessions from partners from that structure. So that could solve some of it. But it really ultimately depends on what sort of outcome you're looking for. For this lawsuit from the FTC that's narrowly focused on consumer prices, that really wouldn't do much.
One of the things that strikes me as a result of our conversation is Amazon have become the leader in so many different areas, some of which are pretty far away from selling books at lower prices. You wonder about the quality of the competition to have allowed the tentacles of Amazon to get as far as they have.
I mean, my own view, and it's for what it's worth, which is almost nothing, I suspect, is that the thing which, I remember years and years ago talking to a British trust buster. I'm not sure how many trusts he ever actually bust. His view back then was the fundamental issue with companies like Amazon was this, alliance between the fulfillment and distribution side and the sales intelligence that you got from gathering data from everywhere. And his view was that it was really difficult to see anyone being able to create a rival distribution network on such a scale. And it does seem to me, if you go back to Neil's point about the quality of competition, one of the reasons why Amazon is so trusted by Wall Street and has been able to expand into all sorts of areas where you might say it's got no particular value added is because people look at that and they go, that's a unreplicable combination, that sort of ability to get things from the till to someone's home address very, very quickly. Therefore, even if they're selling a load of old crap like kind of detectors which don't work, it'll still be fine because there'll be lots of sales fees in it. Well, look, you've been a great sport coming on and talking about it. It's a fantastic book, by the way. Everyone should read it. Sadly, we're both Amazon customers. I know Neil orders virtually everything from them, and I have to say, mainly because it just is so infernally convenient.
Well, I give you a little example this week.
Yeah.
I ordered some printing inks, non-proprietary printing inks, and found that one of them didn't work, or the machine rejected one of them. So I rang up Amazon and they said, we're very sorry, here's your money back, keep the inks, and thank you for letting us know. To be able to get to that point in the UK with a product which you think is unsatisfactory usually would take about half a dozen phone calls and listening to how important your call is to us in your queue. I subsequently discovered, actually, that the inks did work. So I feel a bit bad about it. But I did it in good faith.
That came out of the seller's margins.
We've got to wrap up here before Neil goes off with more tragic consumer tales, which are really of no interest to anyone.
That was A Long Time in Finance with Jonathan Ford and Neil Collins. Production and editing by Nick Hilton, and our sponsorship partner is Briefcase.News. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review it on your podcast app, as that will help new listeners find us.